Good morning, comrades. After Hyderabad meeting, we are starting now a new cycle of study circles, monthly study circles. And many of you have been there in Hyderabad. And then in this study circle series, new series of study circles, in the light of Hyderabad meeting, the content and the direction of this series has been already circulated in the form of a note. But the basis for that note is already discussed that Ravi has circulated a note before the Hyderabad meeting, which we are calling Prelude to Hyderabad. Probably you all remember and you must have all revisited that note once again. That is still the basis for this meeting. And so in this series, whatever positions that we have arrived at and a broad framework that has been discussed in Hyderabad. If you remember Ravi's presentation, those three important domains where we have to explore and answer some of the important questions in those three domains: system, society, and future of India, or Project India. So it is, we realize that it is giving us an immense advantage in analyzing things from this framework. Today, Ravi will give the introduction to the whole series, general introduction to the whole series, and also he will introduce the framework that has been presented in Hyderabad. Some parts of it were discussed there, but because of the paucity of time, some aspects of that presentation were not discussed in detail. So we'll also talk about those aspects. Without wasting time, I request Ravi to initiate his presentation.
Thank you, Bhargav. And so, as Bhargav said, we are starting a new series or sequence of our study circle meetings. And the focus of this sequence will be basically, all the things that we tried to do at Hyderabad. Many of you were there in Hyderabad. As you remember, we had a discussion, a presentation and discussion for the first 1.5 or 2 days on what we called India within and India in the world. And then we had also 3 other presentations, which we just called tutorials, but they were full-scale presentations. We called them tutorials because we wanted to summarize last 10 years of NSI thinking under the title India within and India in the world. So those tutorials were one on political economy, conducted by Bhargav, another one on China, conducted by Madhvi, and a history of left, especially in relation to left's position, basically Communist Party of India in the United Time and later on other communist parties, their position specifically about communalism and rise of, RSS and later on rise of Hindutva, what kind of understanding and position left has had. That was presented by Subhash. Now, what I did, I took 2 days and still could not finish all we had to discuss. So I will not be able to elaborate, that much or whatever was left not done properly at Hyderabad. It's not that we will be able to do it here in more detail. Here, of course, what I did in 2 days, I will try to do in cramp it in 1 hour. And for that, I will just make the introduction to the framework, and one could say that a kind of framework to look at everything from a left perspective that has emerged, in a way, it has taken long to emerge. One could even talk of 30 years, but it has taken at least 15 years or 20 years to emerge. And the first phase of NSI work was summarized in the form of the manifesto of NSI, which was released at the time of only conference NSI has had, that was in founding conference, which was in 2013. And after that, and that, as many of you would know, was very general. There was nothing specific about India. India was in the background, but the world was in the background. That was more about, capitalism and socialism and, in today's time, what kind of tasks emerge, at that general manifesto level. After that, we have kind of focused more on India. It's a political situation which has taken us to issues of democracy, issues of Indian society, Indian civilization, and so on, and specifically with the rise of Hindutva and this regime coming to power, we have been forced to think more concretely about what has been behind the rise of Hindutva and what will it take, at least a theoretical understanding of it, what will it take to defeat these nefarious forces. So what I will do today is just give that framework that has emerged, and hopefully we will have further meetings in which we will cover this framework that it covers in greater detail, as well as the subjects that were covered by Bhargav, Madhavi, and Subhash at Hyderabad. So it will be we are visualizing it, we are anticipating a series of study circle meetings on this, and the subject is such that it deserves our focus. So there is no harm in spending a few upcoming meetings, on the subject that we tried to summarize at Hyderabad. So I have called it an introduction to NSI framework. And I will be speaking mainly in English, but you can stop me whenever needed for if you need some explanation in Hindi, So let me start with I thought of starting with just some random questions, which may not be that random. And I will just, because I will try to finish my whatever I have to say in an hour or so that we have a couple of hours of discussion. So I will just basically follow my slides, so that I don't go here and there. So in order to see why a new framework for left is needed, I thought of starting with raising some questions or mentioning some questions. Has history obeyed the laws of history as conceived or interpreted by us leftists? Such questions, the question I'm going to read out in next 2 slides, is just, these are the questions to be kept in mind, and this is what creates the context or the intellectual climate in which we have to think about things. So has history obeyed the laws of history as conceived or interpreted by us leftists? Why are revolutions so rare? Do they occur or are they made? And if both, then how can the relative importance of the two aspects. Two aspects means, do they occur or are they made? The two aspects be anticipated. Why is religion so ubiquitous? It's everywhere, and so long lasting. It has been there in almost all of human history. Why are the effects of what is called false consciousness so real? How do cultures and civilizations sustain millennial memories? Then the question that we often discuss, what is modernity? Is it European? Is it universal? Or is it going to have multiple forms, multiple kinds of modernities? How do nations arise? What roles have been played by modernity, capitalism, culture, and civilizations in their advent, in their rise? How realistic and how successful are the base superstructure models of social reality? How are social structures, race, caste, gender, etc., related to class structure? How do they interact and determine the actual course of history? And what is behind the diversity of capitalism as it exists in different countries of the world? No two capitalist countries are exactly, identical. Continuing with similar questions, what happened to socialism of the 20th century? Can it be resurrected? And can it be presented as a model for future socialism? Does imperialism of the 20th century, I have just paralleled it with socialism of the 20th century. Does imperialism of the 20th century continue into the new century? Is it the new highest stage? I should have written a stage, not era. Is it the new highest stage of capitalism? Does capitalism necessarily lead to imperialism of some kind? What is behind the Chinese miracle? Is China socialist? Is it capitalist? Is it the new imperialist superpower? Is it necessary for socialism to imbibe capitalism and give room to private sector if it has to develop productive forces leading to productive, innovative, and prosperous industrial economies? Why did liberal democracy and social democratic welfare state run into crisis? Why have neoliberalism, neoliberalism characterized by Reagan, Thatcher, Clinton, Blair, even though they came from different parts of party political spectrum, but they've underlying current was neoliberalism in their case, and neoconservatism, that came in the aftermath of 9/11. It became clear. Kirkpatrick, Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, etc. So why have neoliberalism and neoconservatism to run into crisis? In the sense that after the rise of populist right wing like Trump, what is behind the rise of racist populist right wing? Is the 2-century-long Western domination of the world coming to an end? Is the US on a terminal decline? Is a new world order in the offing? And is it going to be good for the world? And then this last set of these not so random questions. What is behind the rise of communalism and Hindutva fascism in India? Why have the political and ideological ethos and values of the anti-colonial national movement been defeated or gone on the defensive? Are the subterranean fault lines of Indian social civilizational soil, are the subterranean fault lines of the Indian social civilizational soil, Are they creations of the modern era, or have they been merely activated by modernity? What role democracy itself has played in the erosion of the liberal and constitutional democracy? What role has been played by the crony corporate capital in this decline? In the contemporary world, what paths are open to India to become a productive, innovative, and prosperous economy? What can the liberal and the progressives, what can the liberals and the progressives do to stem the tide of Hindutva and of communal politics in general? What kind of idea of India they can create and politically deploy for this purpose? And lastly, what is behind the decline of left in India? Why is it so? Despite the survival of major left parties, numerous radical left groups, and a large number of independent leftists. Where are the answers? Well, not every question has an answer. And we have asked all these questions not to answer it. That will be, it will be too much of a hubris on our part to be able to answer all the questions we pose. So not every question has an answer. Not every question needs to be answered. I mean, it's good to have questions even if you don't have answers. One should not also insist on asking only the questions that can be answered. That also limits your worldview. If you are, not going to ask questions which cannot be easily answered. What is important is to be aware of the questions and the challenges that are implicit in reality, and it is important not to pretend that such questions do not exist. Reality is what it is. In times of crisis, one often needs to reorient oneself to reality. This is true for every individual, whether activist or a strategist or whoever, as well as for the parties and the movements. Left in India, as well as in the world, needs such a reorientation to reality. And that is the, our main argument, that left needs to reorient itself to a changed world. And that is what we try to figure out how to do that, at least theoretically. The task of reorientation, especially on such a large scale, is in the first instance a theoretical and ideological one. New political and organizational strategies will flow from there. Just for completeness sake, all of you are, you know it very well. The NSI journey so far, NSI is a thought collective that strives to think on behalf of the entire left, the left in India that is also conscious of its location in the world. NSI advocates reorientation of the left all over the world, as well as in India. And such a reorientation is necessitated by the passage of 20th century world into which left was born, and emergence of India with robust capitalism and entrenched bourgeois democracy. This is the argument we made in the manifesto, that the world had changed in the sense that the 20th century has passed, in both senses, that 20th century socialism is over, and 20th century capitalism has undergone very deep changes, let us say, And in India also, India became independent in the middle of 20th century. And after that, now we have an India with fairly robust capitalism and fairly entrenched electoral democracy. And in NSI, charting out its course, which is often different from what is a standard, in the standard model of left, or a standard existence of left. The difference of NSI comes from these two NSI project, let us say, difference of NSI project comes from these two realizations. One, a successful revolutionary strategy against entrenched capitalism, which is protected by bourgeois democracy and with popular legitimacy, is yet to be formulated. So no revolution has happened against capitalism in a capitalist countries, which operates where the politics operate through electoral democracy, which gains popular legitimacy for the regime. If under these conditions, no revolution has taken place. No revolution against capitalism has taken place. And the second realization was that 20th century socialism was a socialism of emergency conditions in largely pre-capitalist countries. Soviet Union and China being major examples. China of the past century, and previous century, socialist China of Mao's time. It cannot be a model for future socialism capable of superseding capitalism. It could not supersede capitalism on a strategic and long-term basis. That is why it was defeated. Future socialism must be re-envisioned and redesigned. So the two things through which left is defined, Marxist left is defined, namely, what is our critique of capitalism and how do we propose to replace capitalism with socialism through a revolution against capitalism. That is one part that defines left. And the other part is what is our proposal for socialism? Whatever we want to replace capitalism with, what will be the shape of that, And since we had a model of that in 20th century socialism, but that has come to an end, and there have been definite reasons behind why it came to an end. So that itself cannot be presented as a future socialism. Future socialism will have to be re-envisioned. So this is quickly, this is where NSI was. And then we started our, not with a plan, it has been more or less a decade, that after the manifesto, we started in bits and pieces, we working on various aspects of more concrete problems, especially that India is faced with. And that is what was in a way outlined in that write-up that Bhargav mentioned, Prelude to Hyderabad, in which, India within, namely what is happening inside India and India's position in the world, both the things we have been engaged with, dealing with, trying to make sense of that, educating ourselves, about, so that we can we will be able to say more definite things and propose some kind of outline for what we call reorienting the left, how left should think about India and the concrete problems that it faces. And in that, we have divided that thing in three parts, and that follows from the way a rough and heuristic, a practical framework that we use to understand society and history. We basically divide it, not very theoretically, for practical purposes. We divide it between what we call system and what we call society or rest of society. System is political and economic. Basically, you can say system is something whose rules you can write in the form of a constitution or in a book or in a document, whatever. So system can be, system is largely rule-based. Of course, when it operates through people who come from the society. The society system is not outside the society. So system is part of the society, and system is run by people who come from that society. So it is real and organic thing, but for our conceptual understanding, we separate it, that part which is, political and economic domain of social reality can be articulated more precisely through rules and through philosophies and ideologies. So, for example, political economy, has, which is the bread and butter of Marxist analysis, that is largely part of the system. That is the economic part, and the politics that arises from that economic foundation, or that arises to protect that economic foundation. The political part, which is a state and the way a state is constituted, the way it is designed and the way in practice it operates, that is the political part. This is the system part, and in system part, left proposes that our system is, in one code word, we can say it is a capitalist system and it must be replaced by a socialist system. That is the objective, or that is the dream of left, of various kinds of lefts, but this is largely common to all kinds of left. So project socialism in the domain of system. And when the reason we separate it from rest of society is that we face problems when we try to fit entire society into this base and superstructure model in such a way that economics is the base, economics is the foundation, and everything else, the political as well as the socio-cultural, structures, identities, and phenomena, they all arise out of that base. They all arise um, um, out of the economic base of the system. We find it difficult to fit entire society into that base superstructure model, at least for practical purposes. It is difficult to derive all various organic and very deep-seated aspects of social reality as arising from economic relations, and economic realities. So without going into, we are not theorists, we have to understand society in a practical way, and we have adopted, without going into theoretical controversies, we have adopted a pragmatic attitude that since system can be more clearly defined, the economic and political domain, whatever remains, the major aspects of whatever remains, we call that rest of society. Examples are, for example, religion, caste, gender, ethnicity, other identities and other social relations, all that, non-class social relations, all that we call rest of society. And we have taken a position, it's a controversial position, but we have argued it now for several years, that as in the system part of society, we propose socialism as our project, same way in the society part, rest of society part, we propose modernity as our project. And this modernity is to be defined carefully, and there are a lot of theoretical controversies there, some of which we covered at Hyderabad, and we have been covering in our previous study circles and many other previous efforts of discussion, examples of discussion, and we will go into it again in our future meetings. So how do we define modernity? That is a big controversial question, but the way we define it, this is the desirable goal in the domain of the rest of society. And then lately, in last 3-4 years, some of you will remember we started a discussion in this study circle itself, on partition. Why did partition happen when the subcontinent, got out of British colonialism? And that was driven by the desire to understand why has Hindutva, what has been behind the rise of Hindutva, in India. And in a way, it appears as though the rise of Hindutva is basically telling that we are living in the aftermath of partition in a way. Whatever were the reasons behind partition at the time of independence, that still operates even after partition and even after creation of.
रवि ये चाह रहा था कि जितनी बातें आपने कही है ना, वो थोड़ा हिंदी में भी कह देंगे तो थोड़ा ज्यादा समझने में, एक पिक्चर बनाने में
हाँ, ठीक है, ठीक है।
जी
तो मैं ये कह रहा था कि बेसिक फ्रेमवर्क जो एनएसआई प्रपोज कर रहा है, उसके पीछे एक प्रैक्टिकल थ्योरेटिकल स्ट्रेटजी कह सकते हो कि है, वो ये कि सोसाइटी को बेस सुपर स्ट्रक्चर मॉडल में फिट करने की बजाय, जिसमें मुश्किलें आती हैं और उसमें बहुत सारे थ्योरेटिकल क्वेश्चंस इन्वॉल्व हैं, उनके डिटेल में हम नहीं जाते, लेकिन चूंकि हम मुश्किल फेस करते हैं कि हम कैसे कैपिटलिज्म से रिलीजन निकालें, कि कैसे कैपिटलिज्म से रिलीजन निकलता है या कैपिटलिज्म से कास्ट निकलता है। ऑफन जो सिस्टम का पार्ट है, जिसमें पॉलिटिकल और इकोनॉमिक डोमेन है, जिसमें आप डिफाइन कर सकते हो कि ये कैपिटलिस्ट सिस्टम है इन इट्स इकोनॉमिक्स एंड इन इट्स पॉलिटिक्स। तो जो सिस्टम के प्रॉपर्टीज हैं, उन सिस्टम की प्रॉपर्टीज से आप बाकी सोशल जो 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 सोसाइटी के जो दूसरे एस्पेक्ट्स हैं या दूसरे डीपर फिनोमेना हैं, जैसे कि रिलीजन, जैसे कि कास्ट, जैसे कि जेंडर, उनको उस बेस सुपर स्ट्रक्चर मॉडल में कैसे निकालें, हम कैसे डिराइव करें, कैसे साबित करें कि रिलीजन और कास्ट और जेंडर ये कैपिटलिस्ट सिस्टम का प्रोडक्ट है या कैपिटलिस्ट सिस्टम का सुपर स्ट्रक्चर है। क्योंकि इस तरह की मुश्किलें ये मुश्किलें बहुत मुश्किल हैं और कंट्रोवर्शियल हैं, और 100 साल से इन पर डिबेट चल रहा है, और वो टाइम हम लोगों के पास है नहीं, और नई थियरी गढ़ना हमारा काम नहीं है। तो हम थ्योरेटिकल अंडरस्टैंडिंग प्रैक्टिकल पर्पज से निकालते हैं। तो हमने उसके लिए एक प्रैक्टिकल डिवीजन किया कि हम सिस्टम को, पॉलिटिकल और इकोनॉमिक डोमेन को सिस्टम कहेंगे, बाकी चीजें जैसे कि रिलीजन, कास्ट, जेंडर को रेस्ट ऑफ सोसाइटी कहेंगे। और सिस्टम में जैसे हमारा क्रिटिसिज्म कैपिटलिस्ट सिस्टम का है, हम कैपिटलिस्ट सिस्टम की आलोचना करते हैं और उसकी जगह पर हम सोशलिस्ट सिस्टम प्रपोज करते हैं, वैसे ही सोसाइटी में हम कहते हैं कि हमारी सोसाइटी या रेस्ट ऑफ सोसाइटी, सिस्टम निकालने के बाद जो बची हुई सोसाइटी है, दिमागी तौर पर कहा जाए जो है, वो प्री मॉडर्न है और उसको मॉडर्निटी की जरूरत है। और मॉडर्निटी कैसे परिभाषित की जाएगी, ये लंबा चौड़ा विषय है, इसमें कुछ हम लोगों ने काम किया है और बहुत सारे प्रेजेंटेशंस और डिस्कशन हमारे बीच में हुए हैं और आगे भी होंगे। लेकिन जैसे जो हम अपने स्पेसिफिक ढंग से मॉडर्निटी डिफाइन करते हैं, कि भले ही वो यूरोप में पैदा हुई हो, लेकिन उसका एक यूनिवर्सल कोर है, और जो यूनिवर्सल कोर है वो अलग अलग सोसाइटी में प्लांट किया जा सकता है, उसे रोपा जा सकता है। तो अलग अलग सोसाइटीज की मॉडर्निटीज अपने एक्सप्लिसिट फॉर्म में तो अलग अलग होगी, लेकिन वो इसलिए मॉडर्निटी हम उसको कहेंगे क्योंकि वो उस यूनिवर्सल कोर, जो मॉडर्निटी की जो आत्मा है, उससे निकला हुआ शरीर होगा। तो शरीर अलग अलग देशों का होगा, लेकिन मॉडर्निटी की जो आत्मा होगी वो यूनिवर्सल होगी। और इत्तेफाक से पहला ऐसा एग्जाम्पल यूरोप में आया, उसका अर्थ ये नहीं है कि मॉडर्निटी इन इटसेल्फ यूरोपियन है, वगैरह वगैरह जो हमारी परिभाषा है। तो इससे आसानी ये हो जाती है कि हम रिलेटिवली प्रैक्टिकल सेंस में सिस्टम में अलग से डील कर लेते हैं, कैपिटलिज्म को अलग से डील कर लेते हैं, और मॉडर्निटी के सवालों को अलग, सोशल लाइफ के सवालों को रिलेटिवली अलग से डील कर लेते हैं। और तीसरा सवाल ये पैदा हुआ, जो सिविलाइजेशन का सवाल, जिसमें हम प्रोजेक्ट इंडिया डिफाइन करते हैं, लास्ट 3-4 साल हम लोग एनएसआई में कलेक्टिवली इससे जूझते रहे हैं। वो सवाल हिंदुत्व के राइज से, हिंदुत्व जो पावर में आया है या पावरफुल बना है और कांग्रेस की हेजेमनी को उसने रिप्लेस किया है, ये क्यों हुआ है, कैसे हुआ है, इसकी इस ये न तो सिस्टम और सोसाइटी, जो 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 कैपिटलिज्म और मॉडर्निटी सिर्फ इतने मात्र से कवर नहीं होता, इसमें हमें ज्यादा कॉन्क्रीट होना पड़ेगा कि ये चीजें, सिस्टम और सोसाइटी का जो रूप हिंदुस्तान में रहा है, उसमें कौन से ऐसे कारण और कौन सी ऐसी जगहें रही हैं जिनका इस्तेमाल करके कम्युनल फोर्सेस 100 साल पहले से एक्टिव हुई, ताकत उनकी बढ़ी, और उनको यहाँ तक कि पार्टीशन भी हुआ इंडिपेंडेंस के टाइम में। और जो कारण थे पार्टीशन के पीछे, जो हमने एनालाइज करना करीब 3-4 साल पहले या सीखना समझना शुरू किया, उसी का आफ्टर माथ आज भी चल रहा है हिंदुस्तान में। और उसी के आफ्टर माथ के रूप में उस सवाल को ठीक ढंग से उस सवाल से ठीक ढंग से हिंदुस्तान निपट नहीं पाया है। इसी वजह से हिंदुत्व और हिंदुत्व फासिज्म का उदय हुआ है, और जिसकी वजह से हमारा आर्गुमेंट ये है कि कैपिटलिज्म को सोशलिज्म से हटाया जाना चाहिए। ये लॉजिक सोसाइटी में जिस तरह के सोशल हायरार्किकल और अन्यायपूर्ण स्ट्रक्चर्स हैं, उनको हटाने में मॉडर्निटी की मदद लेनी चाहिए। इस आर्गुमेंट के अलावा हमें एक तीसरे लेयर पर भी देखना होगा कि हम भारत को, यानी सोशलिज्म और मॉडर्निटी के क्वेश्चन मेन क्वेश्चंस होंगे, लेकिन उसके अलावा भारत की आइडेंटिटी, भारत क्यों इकट्ठा है, क्यों एक रिपब्लिक के बीच में है, कैसे सब कॉन्टिनेंट इकट्ठा हुआ, ब्रिटिशर्स ने अगर कॉलोनियलिज्म ने उसको इकट्ठा किया, तो उसके अंडरनीथ, उसके नीचे भारत की जमीन में भारतीयता का कोई रूप बह रहा था कि नहीं, भारतीयता किसी न किसी रूप में पॉलिटिकल एरिना में ऑपरेट कर रही थी कि नहीं, ये हमें देखना पड़ेगा। और अगर लेफ्ट और प्रोग्रेसिव लोग और यहाँ तक कि लिबरल बुर्जुआ भी इस सवाल से नहीं निपटेगा कि भारत क्या है, तो भारत की परिभाषा कोई और देता रहेगा, हिंदुत्व वाली परिभाषा दी जाती रहेगी या धर्म आधारित परिभाषा दी जाती रहेगी, और उससे निपटना मुश्किल होता रहेगा। तो एक तीसरा डायमेंशन हम लोगों ने खोला, जो जिसको हम सिविलाइजेशन का डायमेंशन कहते हैं, और मॉडर्निटी की तरह सिविलाइजेशन की भी हमारी अपनी परिभाषा है, अपनी एक प्रैक्टिकल काम चलाऊ परिभाषा है सिविलाइजेशन की, और उस पर भी कुछ डिस्कशन हुआ है, आगे और डिस्कशन होगा। और उस सिविलाइजेशन की जिस तरह से हम परिभाषा देते हैं, जो धर्म आधारित नहीं है, जो हिस्टोरिकल इमेजिनरी जिसको हम कहते हैं, कि हिस्ट्री में जो जो हुआ है, भारत की हिस्ट्री में, भारत की जमीन जिसे आज भारत कहा जाता है, उस जमीन की हिस्ट्री में, वहां के लोगों की हिस्ट्री में जो जो हुआ है, उनमें से कौन सी ऐसी चीजें हम पिक करें, कौन सी ऐसी चीजें चुनें, और उन चुनी हुई चीजों के आधार पर भारतीय सभ्यता की एक प्रस्तावना रखें, जिसके आधार, जिसको हिंदुत्व वाले भारतीयता के बरक्स खड़ा किया जा सके। ये हमारा आर्गुमेंट है। तो ये बेसिक हमारा फ्रेमवर्क है, एनएसआई का बेसिक फ्रेमवर्क है, प्रोजेक्ट सोशलिज्म, प्रोजेक्ट मॉडर्निटी, प्रोजेक्ट इंडिया। पॉलिटिकल सिस्टम की पहले थोड़ी बात करते हैं, या आपको याद ही दिला रहा हूं मैं, 1 घंटे में जो हम 2 दिन में नहीं कर पाए हैदराबाद में, वो 1 घंटे में कैसे कर पाएंगे, और 1 घंटा पता नहीं, ऑलरेडी आधा घंटा निकल गया है शायद। सो लेट अस सी हाउ इट गोज। हम जब 1 घंटा कहते हैं तो 1.5 घंटा मान के चलिए। सो इट्स फर्स्ट लेट मी जस्ट ब्रीफली टॉक अबाउट द पॉलिटिकल सिस्टम। Political system, you can see 3 parts. How did Indian Republic emerge? How did Indian Republic come into existence? So national movement was there. National movement was is the foundational basis of emergence of Indian Republic. National movement against the British. Gandhian depth politics. We will talk more about it. What do we mean by depth politics? When a modern politics intervenes in the social cultural mind of an old society, of an society that comes from ancient times till today, if modern politics intervenes in the given society, that is what we call depth politics. And Gandhian depth politics, by that we mean that Gandhi mobilized the Indian masses, possibly for the first time in entire Indian history, on a subcontinental scale. He mobilized the Indian masses into a very modern project, namely project of independence, namely project of anti-colonialism. So that we call depth politics. So national movement through Gandhian depth politics led to partition, because no matter how modern the project, the society was pre-modern, and there were social, civilizational, cultural, religious fault lines, which could not have been avoided probably. They played a major role even during the national movement. These communal divides and other aspects of our social, civilizational, cultural reality, that led to partition and also to independence. That is how the Indian Republic came into existence. It based itself on a constitutional framework. Basic constitutional framework is that of modernity and capitalism. So constitution has both the aspect, the capitalist aspect and the modern aspect of modernity. One aspect we criticize, we are opposed to the capitalist, dimension of that constitutional framework, but we support the modern aspect, equal citizenship, human rights, equality before law, one person, one voter, one vote, one person, one vote. And all these things are the properties of political modernity that is also very much enshrined in the same, what we call bourgeois constitution, out of which an institutional framework arises in which there are separation of powers. Those separations of powers are now being destroyed by this regime, but constitution enshrined that separation of powers, that there will be independent constitutional bodies. Broadly speaking, the executive, the government, will arise out of electoral democracy. That executive, will be directly under the control of the voter, but in order to safeguard that the democracy works according to certain rules, and through democracy itself does not get undone. Some kind of majoritarian authoritarian power, government does not arise. So there were curtailments of the powers of the executive through parliament itself. The parliament is elected, but entire parliament is not government. So parliament keeps a check on the executive. So the executive part was put under the supervision, critique, or partly control of the legislative part, the parliament, which has the power to enact laws or change laws, and from both of them, executive and the legislative, yet another branch of the state came out, which is judiciary, and then there are other constitutional bodies which are supposed to be only under the constitutional rule and not under the direct control of executive or legislative or judiciary, but all of them, as you know, are today being destroyed. And that, of course, raises question for us, that when those constitutional bodies are being destroyed, these checks and balances, this separation of power is being undone, does it concern a leftist? The leftist doesn't care, because this is all part internal to the bourgeois state. So the leftist doesn't care, or leftist defends the separation of powers, whatever is happening today. That is a live burning question in Indian politics today. But that institutional framework comes out of the constitution, and then also the legal framework comes, through which the judiciary operates, and through which you and I can go to the court, and under that legal framework to seek justice on this or that issue. So that is the constitutional part, but constitution itself by itself cannot enact a state. So that, it has to depend on the democratic process, which then offers legitimacy to whichever regime comes to power. And this democracy in India has been competitive electoral democracy operating through multiple parties, and this is the operational version of depth politics, in which when competitive electoral democracy operates, necessarily the social mind comes into play. So that you see every day, in what is called social engineering, the offering to represent, this or that religious identity, this or that caste identity, and so on. So those religion, caste, and other forms of social structure, they are millennial, they have been there in India for thousands of years, but they become operative in modern politics through competitive electoral democracy, because parties have to design strategies to defeat other parties, and in that social mind becomes operational. So that is what we call depth politics. I will just read, even though I'm taking time, but still, to shorten it further, I will just read it, and again, I will have to, because whole screen is not, can I move it? No, I cannot move it. So I will have to, okay, let me read it. So the political system, the constitutional framework, this is taken from Prelude to Hyderabad. The constitutional framework of the Indian Republic, for example, consists of two parts that are conceptually distinct. One is designed to serve and maintain the capitalist system, and the other is aimed at promoting modernity through ideals such as equal citizenship, equality of all before the law, and human rights. There hasn't always been clarity regarding this in the left circles. If the socialist project and the leftist forces are opposed to the constitution in its entirety because it is bourgeois in character, and the aspects of equal citizenship and human rights are mere camouflage, then why defend it against the onslaught of the Hindutva fascists? Most of the left has decided wisely to join hands with the liberal democratic forces in the fight against Hindutva majoritarianism and fascism. But one needs to be clear about reasons and political objectives behind it. Left is opposed to the capitalist system, but it stands in support of political modernity as manifested in equal citizenship and human rights. And then we mentioned, I have taken a paragraph, how this liberal democracy, the design that of democracy under the constitutional framework, how it has come under crisis, how it is facing challenges and crises, not only India, but all over the world. So about the liberal democracy, first, liberal democracy has invariably resulted in creation of what is often described as the deep state. Deep state means, one that is not directly elected, and where does it exist and how does it operate and where does its power come from, is not under the control and vigilance of the people. Democracy, ideally, is supposed to make the state transparent and accountable to the people. In practice, it has increasingly diverged from this ideal. It is to be acknowledged that a country, especially a large and populous one, cannot be governed by direct democracy or by continuously conducting referenda. You cannot call all Indians to assemble in a football ground, to vote for this or that policy. That's what is being referred to. This has given rise to various forms and practices of indirect democracy. It has also resulted in elaborate arrangements for separation of powers among different branches of the state and for instituting complex mechanisms of the so-called checks and balances. I have talked about all this already. These arrangements are an integral part of the constitutional framework under which democracy is supposed to function. Complexity of the constitutional, legal, and institutional framework and of the democratic functioning and practices offer ample leeway for taking much of the state power beyond the reach of democratic control. This, of course, has been a common feature, more or less, of all forms of functioning democracy. The blame for corruption, elitism, unaccountability, and so on of the rulers, in general for the creation of the deep state, has stuck especially to liberal democracy because of its hegemonic status in world polity and in the post-war period. So because liberal democracy has been dominant for, for almost 4 decades after 1945, when the New World Order was created after the Second World War, liberal democracy has been in power in most of the capitalist and quote-unquote democratic countries. So whatever has happened in those polities, corruption being one aspect, has our elitism being free of any popular control, or mass control or people's control, all those things have been blamed on liberal democracy itself. And that is how the right wing, the populist democracy, the right wing that appeals not to modern values, but to pre-modern identities of race and religion and so on, that is how they have arisen. That is what is being alluded to in this paragraph from Prelude to Hyderabad. Continuing that, second, liberal democracy has been challenged on cultural ideological grounds. This, in fact, has presented a far more effective challenge. If the crises were confined to the realms of political legitimacy and economic hardship, leftists would have had a far better chance of challenging the standard model of capitalism and democracy. Left, is better known for economic justice, and political modernity, and yet left has not benefited from the crisis of liberal democracy. Why? Because liberal democracy has been challenged not on the system ground as much as on the cultural ideological ground of rest of society. Instead, the crises have resulted in the upswing of the right wing. Far more naked forms of crony capitalism have appeared in all instances where the populist authoritarian right wing has wrested power from the liberal democrats. This forces a reconsideration on the roles played by cultural and ideological factors such as nation, religion, civilization, ethnicity, and other forms of visible and invisible identities. This also, democracy also, functions in this under this triangle of capital, state, and people. So both these phenomena, one of deep state hiding behind liberal democracy, and the other of rise of populist authoritarian and cultural nationalist right wing, arise out of the dynamic interaction between capitalism and democracy. They represent differing modes of managing the triangular relationship among capital, state, and people. State mediates between capital and people, but this mediation basically amounts to managing people in the interest of capital. In today's world, democracy appears to offer these two choices, namely liberal democracy with a deep state or populist autocracy with crony capitalism. These are the two choices. It brings to life the proverbial choice between the Scylla and Charybdis. So it continues. Now, here is the definition, so to speak, or description of depth politics. Demons sleeping in the depths of history are often awakened by electoral competition and democratic scramble for political power. Borrowing a metaphor from depth psychology, where the unconscious sitting underneath the conscious mind, it is brought into play of therapy. This is reference to Freudian psychoanalysis. Freud came up with this concept of unconscious, over which the individual has no control. We are not using that. We are just using that as metaphor. Competitive electoral democracy can be seen as a form of depth politics in which the political actors, parties and leaders and ideologies, political actors dig into the social and civilizational unconscious. Depth politics arises when a modern political and economic system arrives in a civilization that has existed for centuries and millennia and hasn't had a sustained engagement with modernity so far. The Indian left is yet to acknowledge the existence and the political weight of the Indian unconscious. Obviously, it is far from devising technologies for rewiring it. It will be an enormous challenge to work out the detail of depth political strategies that the left must forge. I mean, what I'm saying is that left has a simplistic understanding, that it goes by understanding of the state arising out of the political economic base, and so class interest, is the primary arena, or class struggle is the primary arena, which operates in the political struggle of democracy. So the importance of the social mind of the voter and what kind of positions you take about that and how do you deal with that this problem has not been dealt with properly or satisfactorily by left. So it doesn't have a strategy for how to make use of or how to rewire the social mind, the social civilizational unconscious, or what I have at times called Indian unconscious. Such a rewiring can be best accomplished through depth politics itself. Of course, the left will have to handle this politics very differently from the way Gandhi did, and obviously very differently from the diabolical forces that have used this politics to reach the seats of power in India today. So different from Gandhi's depth politics and different from Hindutva depth politics. How do left and liberals have to come up with their own depth politics? Because often the liberal bourgeois forces, when they come to depth politics, they imitate Hindutva or they imitate Gandhi. They don't have their own models. Of course, let them worry about that, but the leftists have to worry about their own strategy for dealing with the depth political reality. So now I start with the economic system. So that was the political system. We are still in the system domain, where project socialism was defined. I have been spending last few minutes with the political part. Now quickly the economic system part. I am tempted to stop and ask questions, but that will take even more time. So let me just, and since most of you are familiar with what I am talking about, so let me run through these slides quickly, and then we will have more time for discussion. There you can raise questions. So please make a note of whatever questions you might have, and let me run through the slides. So now let us come to the economic system. Economic system in India, of course, we call it capitalist economic system, and that has, it has had a history. The history overlaps with the history of the Indian Republic. In the political arena, the economic system started with Nehruvian socialism. He came up with the idea of mixed economy, in which state played a big role. State intervened in the economy in a big way. State public sector was considered as the commanding heights of the economy. Private sector was allowed, but state had in various degrees, in various times, the state had control over the general policy directions of the economy. So basically, private sector, it had to operate under the domination of a state and public sector. And the state also adopted welfare measures. This was the, you can say, Nehruvian period. After that, a transition period happened, through post-emergency phase of Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. And by 1991, when economic liberalization of Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh came, then we know that through liberalization, privatization, globalization, the mixed economy was not completely undone, but it was largely undone, and market and capital, these aspects, the private sector was given a far freer hand as compared to the period of welfare state of Nehruvian socialist period. And now that has now landed up all the way into naked crony capitalism, where few corporate houses are in league with the regime, with the government, and they practically, government which is wedded to few corporate houses, and as a marketist, corporatist strategy for Indian economy. This is the situation today, and that is where Indian economy has landed. So this graph, there were many graphs at Hyderabad. I just picked up one. This I wanted to show you the structure, sectoral structure of the Indian economy. And I don't know if you are viewing this, participating in this meeting through your smartphones and not through your laptop. I don't know how much you can see on the screen of your smartphone. But if you look
Yes,
so
we
this
can
is
see.
agriculture, which was 35% of the entire economy, contributed 35% of the GDP in 1984, has come down to around 2020, it has come down to about 15%, and so on. So you can see that, for example, this finance and real estate, that has arisen from less than about close to 5% in 1988, 84, 85 to now. Finance and real estate is the largest sector of Indian economy. Okay, manufacturing has been around 16-17%, in 18 and 84, 85, and through ups and downs, it is more or less at the same place, and so on. So you don't have to pay attention to the details. My purpose was to show that a fairly drastic change in the composition or a structure of Indian economy has taken place in this period, which is post-Nehru period. I mean, taking from 84, 85 till today. And you see how, today I am just presenting the rough framework, so I don't have time to go into the details, but fairly deep structural changes, in the capitalist economy of India has taken place. Broad features of Indian economy are that it is a capitalist economy with highly uneven capitalist development, featuring the regime of commodity and money is all embracing. Whatever we consume, we buy, and is available in the market. Labor power is universally recognized as a commodity, central feature of capitalist economy. Accumulation of capital is in the driver's seat of economy. So all state policies are aimed at growth rate of the GDP, and the strategy that is followed, especially in the crony capitalist period, and even earlier, especially after the LPG, liberalization, privatization, globalization phase, that, you give better, you kind of help and support the capital so that it has more incentives to take the economy to accelerate the growth rate. So the growth rate of the economy is largely determined by the encouragement of capital to accumulate and invest. Relative maturation of capital and yet abundance of untapped political potential for growth. India is a middle-sized, middle level of economy where there is mature capital, but also there are large sectors of the economy, which is not under the complete sway of big capital. Agriculture, land being one large example. Accumulation of capital through capitalist profit making as well as through primitive accumulation. So those two things, the regular capitalist, mechanism, that profit accruing to capital becomes the investment for the next round. So accumulation of capital happens through regular capitalist means, but also large assets, are to be taken over by private capital, land, forest, mines, and so on. And all India was a mixed economy. Public sector was large, so large part of public sector has been privatized and is now being privatized. All that I roughly call primitive accumulation. They haven't. It is not, part of their assets yet, and their assets grow by privatization or by taking assets from smaller landholders or from public ownership of mines and privatization of public ownership of mines and forests and so on. Much touted high GDP growth rate has two main sources: cheap labor and accumulation by privatizing and monetizing public assets, mountains of money to be made by grabbing land, forest mines, licenses, etc. And virgin fields of mature capital is also there in India, as I was saying, that a lot of, not a lot of a small capitalist or non-capitalist, parts of the economy to be taken over by advanced capital. This is different from advanced capitalist countries where there are no virgin fields, and also it is different from underdeveloped economies compared to India's, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, where mature capital is not there. Okay. Unevenness of capitalist development spurs growth, but it can also cause instabilities and turbulence. For example, among the lowest level of social wage in the world, Indian wage level is very low, amongst the lowest in the world. Large scale unemployment is there, chronic and widespread poverty and deprivation. All this may lead to social upheaval, even though in India, we leftists keep on waiting for that kind of positive social upheaval. It never happens, but our theory says that it should happen. If people starve, then people should revolt, hopefully they will. So especially under the conditions of rapid growth, and despite traditional acceptability of suffering as a part of established social order. So suffering as a part of established social order is very typical of India. And despite that, governments have to keep an eye on the level of unemployment, poverty, deprivation that people can bear. So it's not that governments are not conscious of that feature. Land becomes gold when touched by capital. Every landowner waits for capital to appear at the village gate. We in the movement often talk about protesting against land being taken by government or by large private capital. But we should also keep in mind that people also wait for large capital to appear, and to offer high price for their land, which happens around all large cities or even small cities, towns and other economic establishments, or manufacturing establishment that come in the neighborhood, that takes the land prices up, and people are not unhappy about that. Neoliberal reforms offer mouth-watering prospects for big capital, but they cannot get all they want. Crony capitalism is possible only under the spell of death politics, majoritarian authoritarianism, and fascistic strongest state. What is being said is that this nakedly crony capitalist measures and attitudes of this government, this becomes possible only because the government or the ruling party has control over the people by other means, which is through religion and identities and communalism and so on. So the depth politics enables a crony capitalist regime, to do whatever it wants to do. Capital can't, despite all these things that is in favor of capital, including this present regime, capital can't get all it wants. State to continue to play a big role in economy because capital is not safe in the market. So without government, capital is, without government, even the biggest and most favored corporate house will not be what it is. All the gain it has had, a spectacular growth in power and assets that it has had, has happened because of the government. Dangerous consequences of big capital marching into sectors populated by hundreds of millions of workers, the small producers and petty capitalists. The state must play a big role in reducing dangers by spending a significant part of its revenues. So if the traditional sectors of where millions of workers are employed, including agriculture, where small producers are millions in numbers, and a small capitalist operate as their, for example, as your neighborhood shopkeeper, if all of them are to be replaced by big capital, which big capital is ready to replace, we all order various things on Amazon and Big Basket and Blinkit or whatnot, there is danger there also. And government has to tread the ground appropriately and cautiously, so that if big capital takes large part of this middle sector away from the middle sector, then how is middle sector compensated in the sense that how do people survive? How the people who lose their businesses and jobs, and income, how are they kept reasonably? How are they stopped from revolting against the regime? I mean, government has to do something about that. So capital, what it would like to do, cannot do immediately and in the most naked form. Full-scale neoliberalism, complete sovereignty of market, and unbridled swallowing of the entire economy by big capital will spell disaster. Including, this is not only the case for Indian capital. Global capital also must heed the social and political realities of India, just as Indian capital, in addition to this, must also heed the global realities. So it is a complex, world in which Indian capital largely deals with problems of Indian economy, and global capital comes here paying attention to realities of the Indian economy. And the Indian capital, which primarily operates in the Indian economy, also has to keep in mind and has to, chart out its course in an integrated global economy. I'm just counting features, of Indian economy, Indian polity, and so on, the system part. Now about Indian economy. Labor. So that was about capital. Labor, what are the options for labor? Labor can potentially have one big strategy, although actually existing left is not yet in a position to put this into action. That one big strategy is based on points like overwhelming majority of working people, more than 90%, work in the unorganized sectors in India. Largest such sector is agriculture, that still employs more than half of the workforce, or maybe half of the workforce, while contributing less than a sixth of the total GDP. For the workers in these sectors to get organized, the principal strategy would be mutual cooperation, one form of which will be cooperatives, to survive, prosper, and assist. We haven't discussed this part in last few years, but we used to discuss that in late, around after 2015 or so, between 2015 and 2020, this was one of the major discussions we used to have about strategy for organizing labor in an economy where 90% of people, more than 90% of people work in the unorganized sectors. These cooperatives, or this will be schools to prepare the working people in the informal sectors for class struggle, just as this is analogous to the role played by trade unions in the earlier industrial and manufacturing phase of capitalism. This is a phenomena all over the world, except in China. Manufacturing is never the largest part of industrial part of the economy, is never the largest part of any fairly advanced capitalist economy. So we can have a wish list, what do we want, from, given the fact that, left is not in a position to replace capitalism by socialism. Left is not in a position to immediately, have revolution, and entirely restructure the economy along socialist lines. Under the given condition, what could we hope for? What could we wish for? So these points are extinguishing fire. Fire is, I have taken this acronym from an economist, Marxist economist, Michael Hudson. He called it FIRE, means finance, insurance, and real estate. These FIRE sectors, finance, insurance, and real estate, these are the largest part of economies in most advanced capitalist countries. So extinguishing the fire, namely a state monopoly over finance and insurance sectors. We desire a state monopoly over finance and insurance sectors, as opposed to private banks and private insurance companies. They take large part of the surplus created by a society, take it away, as their income. And a strongly regulated real estate sector. We can't imagine real estate sector being entirely public, but this must be strongly regulated. Then we also wish for a strong welfare state where health and education are the largest sectors and they are entirely state responsibility. There is some provision for universal basic income because increasingly the capitalist economy is proving incapable of employing, majority of people. And affirmative actions for deprived sections, we must have, for example, reservations in India, we have in jobs and education and so on. But beyond reservations too, further affirmative actions, so that the sections of the society which are deprived or which have been left behind can be supported and enabled to compete in the market. Redesigning subsumed class processes. Here there is a technical word. Subsumed class processes is whatever surplus is generated in an economy. The direct class process is at the place of production in a factory or on the field, where labor produces all the value, but it gets only wages, and rest of it is surplus which is taken over by the owner of capital or owner of asset. Okay, so this is the direct class process. A subsumed class process is that the surplus that is generated at the production place, there are other mechanisms for redistribution of that surplus. For example, just to give you an example to understand, for example, taxes. Government imposes taxes on all kinds of income or different kinds of incomes. So the surplus that is appropriated at the place of production, that surplus is partly taken, part of that surplus is taken over by the government, and then the government, for example, spends it on education or health or infrastructure or whatever. So that is a subsumed class process. The part of surplus being taken away by government and to spend on things which were not in the design of the place from which that part of surplus was taken, from which the tax was taken. Once I pay tax, I have no control on how that tax is spent. That is the domain of the government, And so all such processes where surplus appropriated at the workplace is redistributed throughout the economy, those are called subsumed class processes in a term used by some Marxist, Althusserian Marxist economists. And we make use of that term for our purpose. We used to discuss this a lot some 10 years ago. So redesigning sectoral structure of the economy that we design. For example, we would like the tax on the rich to, be increased, and welfare state is to be instituted, activated on the basis of large taxes collected from the rich. That is on our wish list, even in the capitalist economy. So redesigning sectoral structure of the economy, policy intervention in the market and in the economy, and also redesigning the share of wage, profit, interest, and rent. That is how GDP in the bourgeois economics, that is how the GDP is divided. The GDP is in 4 parts: wage, profit, interest, and rent. And the relative weight of these 4 large components of GDP, that relative weight should be changed or should be redesigned, which is more in favor of wages and of welfare state, and less, as a remuneration to ownership, and so on. And for developing productive forces, higher education is needed, innovative society is needed, division of responsibility between public and private sectors are to be changed. In our wish list, public sector role has to increase, and growth and development based mainly on internal consumption, supplemented by export-led growth. And this we have discussed, often when we discuss China, that China became rich largely through its export-led growth, but we don't have that option. In our case, assuming that India will remain a capitalist economy, Indian growth will have to depend largely on internal consumption, supplemented by export-led growth. And all this is on our wish list because our primary wish list is that enlightened, welfarist, and industrial capitalism, if India reaches that kind of a stage, Indian capitalism is forced to take that trajectory, then it will become easier for the desirable transition to a socialist economy. Let me skip this. This goes into further detail about material incentive, moral incentive, and fulfillment incentive. Yeah,
अभी
go
जो
ahead.
पिछला वाला पेज अभी जो तुमने बताया
Yeah.
उसको तो अगर हिंदी में बता दो ज्यादा ठीक रहेगा, थोड़ा सा मतलब एक थोड़ा क्योंकि अलग की बात
क्या जब हमारी अर्थव्यवस्था पूंजीवादी अर्थव्यवस्था है और ये हमारी इच्छा पर नहीं है कि हम तुरंत इसे समाजवादी अर्थव्यवस्था बना दें, तुरंत हम रिवोल्यूशन कर दें, तो इसी पूंजीवादी अर्थव्यवस्था में हमारा विश लिस्ट क्या है, हम क्या चाहते हैं, हमारे लिए डिजायरेबल पॉलिसीज इस कैपिटलिस्ट इकोनॉमी में क्या होंगी। तो पहला हम ये कहते हैं कि जो सारी आज की इस नई सदी की पूंजीवादी अर्थव्यवस्थाओं में फायर सेक्टर का, यानी फाइनेंस का, इंश्योरेंस का, बैंकिंग सेक्टर, इंश्योरेंस सेक्टर और रियल एस्टेट सेक्टर, ये सबसे बड़े मिल करके टुगेदर ये मिल करके सबसे बड़े सेक्टर्स बन गए हैं और ये पूरे प्राइवेट हाथों में गए हैं। तो इनकी जो और ये सारे ये प्रोड्यूस उतना नहीं करते जितना ये सरप्लस अप्रोप्रिएट करते हैं। दूसरी जगह का इनकम ये हथिया लेते हैं। तो इनका रोल कम होना चाहिए, ये हमारा एक, और इनका रोल कम करने के लिए हमें फाइनेंस और इंश्योरेंस पर स्टेट की मोनोपोली होनी चाहिए, गवर्नमेंट के कंट्रोल में होना चाहिए वो, और रेगुलेशन होना चाहिए रियल एस्टेट सेक्टर का। रियल एस्टेट सेक्टर पर अंकुश लगाया जाना चाहिए। हम जानते हैं इंडिया के केस में क्या क्या कारनामे किए हैं रियल एस्टेट सेक्टर ने। स्ट्रॉन्ग वेलफेयर स्टेट हम चाहते हैं जिसमें हेल्थ और एजुकेशन जो है वो इकोनॉमी का न केवल लार्जेस्ट सेक्टर हो बल्कि वो स्टेट की रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी हो। चूंकि आज की आधुनिक पूंजीवादी अर्थव्यवस्थाएं अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट के सवाल से डील नहीं कर पाती, सबके लिए इनकम इंश्योर नहीं कर पाती, इसलिए उनकी ये जिम्मेदारी बनती है कि कोई काम करे चाहे ना करे, किसी न किसी तरह से, किसी न किसी क्राइटेरिया पर सबको सरकार की तरफ से इनकम हो। यूनिवर्सल बेसिक इनकम का कॉन्सेप्ट सारी दुनिया के कैपिटलिस्ट कंट्रीज में डिस्कस हो रहा है, तो वो उसको हम सपोर्ट करते हैं। यूनिवर्सल बेसिक इनकम लोगों को पास आना चाहिए एंड लोगों के अपने इनकम बियॉन्ड दैट होना चाहिए। हाउ दैट विल बी वर्कड आउट इन ए रिलेटिवली पुअर इकोनॉमी, लाइक इंडिया जैसी गरीब अर्थव्यवस्था में, उसके लिए हमें मशक्कत करनी पड़ेगी, उसका डिजाइन हमें करना पड़ेगा। और जो डिप्राइव्ड सेक्शंस हैं, जो पीछे छूट गए हैं, चाहे सामाजिक कारणों से चाहे आर्थिक कारणों से, उनके लिए अफर्मेटिव एक्शन, उनके लिए उनको विशेष सहयोग दिया जाना चाहिए, चाहे रिजर्वेशन के रूप में, चाहे उनको एनेबल करने के रूप में, ताकि वो compete कर सकें, उनको एजुकेशन दे करके, उनके हेल्थ को मैनेज करके वगैरह वगैरह। तीसरा ये कि सारी कैपिटलिस्ट अर्थव्यवस्थाओं में जहां जो सरप्लस अप्रोप्रिएट किया जाता है, वो जहां प्रोडक्शन होता है वहां सरप्लस पैदा होता है, और वहां जो सरप्लस अप्रोप्रिएट किया जाता है उसको डायरेक्ट क्लास प्रोसेस कहते हैं। उसके अलावा कैपिटलिस्ट अर्थव्यवस्थाओं में जो सरप्लस प्रोडक्शन की जगह पर जो सरप्लस पैदा होता है और अप्रोप्रिएट किया जाता है, लिया जाता है ओनर्स के द्वारा, मालिकों के द्वारा, वो रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूट होता है पूरी सोसाइटी में टैक्सेस के जरिए या दूसरे तरीकों से। तो जो रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ सरप्लस है, उसको हम सबस्यूम क्लास प्रोसेस कहते हैं, और इसका बहुत बड़ा रोल है किसी भी इकोनॉमी के डिजाइन में। कितना टैक्स लेते हैं, किस बात पर खर्च करते हैं, वगैरह वगैरह। इसमें जो है, यानी पूरी इकोनॉमी में जिसके सारे प्रोडक्शन को आप 4 हिस्सों में देखते हैं, मजदूरी के रूप में कितना दिया जाता है, प्रॉफिट के रूप में कितना दिया जाता है, इंटरेस्ट के रूप में, यानी जो आप लोन देते हैं, बैंक्स लोन देते हैं, जिसके पास पैसा है वो लोन देता है, तो वो इंटरेस्ट के रूप में सरप्लस कितना रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूट होता है, और रेंट के रूप में, यानी जो आप ओनर हैं जमीन के, फैक्ट्री जिस जमीन पर है उसके, मकानों के, वगैरह वगैरह, या प्रोडक्टिव एसेट्स के ओनर हैं, उसको आप रेंट आउट करते हैं प्रोडक्टिव प्रोसेस के लिए या रहने के लिए, तो उसको रेंट कहते हैं। तो वेज, प्रॉफिट, इंटरेस्ट और रेंट, इन 4 हिस्सों में जो टोटल नया प्रोडक्शन, टोटल जीडीपी, जो जो जिसको सरप्लस भी कहा जा सकता है एक अर्थ में, वो जो है ना, वेज को छोड़ करके, सरप्लस प्लस वेज ये टोटल इनकम है, वेज प्लस सरप्लस ये टोटल नया जीडीपी है। और इस नया जीडीपी के ये 4 हिस्से हैं, और इन चारों हिस्सों के आपसी रिश्ते क्या है, वेज कोई इकोनॉमी वेज को दबाए जा सकती है, कम करती जा सकती है, इंटरेस्ट रेट बढ़ा सकती है, और ऐसे मौके पैदा कर सकती है कि प्रॉफिट का शेयर बढ़ता जाए इकोनॉमी में। ये हम नहीं चाहते, हम इसका उल्टा चाहते हैं। हम चाहते हैं कि वेजेस का रेशियो बढ़े इकोनॉमी में, ओके, और रेंट का और इंटरेस्ट का और प्रॉफिट का रेशियो कम, ओके। Generally speaking, I mean, I am not giving a uniform formula. This is a complicated business. लेकिन generally speaking हमारा ये विश लिस्ट है। और प्रोडक्टिव फोर्सेस डेवलप करने के लिए इकोनॉमी में हायर एजुकेशन और इनोवेशन को प्रमोट किया जाना चाहिए। उसके जो भी तरीके हो, हमारे मॉडल में, हमारी विश लिस्ट में ये गवर्नमेंट के द्वारा किया जाना चाहिए। और एजुकेशन जो है, इंक्लूडिंग हायर एजुकेशन, मेनली गवर्नमेंट का जिम्मा होना चाहिए। इसका उल्टा हो रहा है हमारी इकोनॉमी में, लेकिन हम चाहते हैं ये गवर्नमेंट का जिम्मा होना चाहिए। और पब्लिक और प्राइवेट सेक्टर के बीच का जो डिवीजन ऑफ लेबर है वो बदला जाना चाहिए। ये पब्लिक सेक्टर सिकुड़ता गया है, प्राइवेट सेक्टर बढ़ता गया है। ये भी हमारी इच्छा के अनुरूप, लेफ्टिस्ट इच्छा के अनुरूप नहीं हुआ है। और ग्रोथ और डेवलपमेंट जो है वो पूरी इकोनॉमी में, अपने यहाँ के, हम एक गरीब अर्थव्यवस्था है, हमारे यहाँ इकोनॉमी बढ़ना चाहिए लोगों का लिविंग स्टैंडर्ड उठाकर, लोगों का कंजम्पशन उठाकर। सो हमारे यहाँ जो जीडीपी ग्रोथ होना चाहिए, दैट शुड बी लार्जली ड्रिवन बाय उसका ड्राइवर कौन होगा? उसका ड्राइवर लार्जली इंटरनल कंजम्पशन, यानी हिंदुस्तान पैदा करेगा और लार्जली हिंदुस्तान ही उसको कंज्यूम करेगा, इस मॉडल पर होगा। हम इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड के रोल को निगेट नहीं करते, लेकिन टोटली इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड पर डिपेंड करना, टोटली एक्सपोर्ट पर डिपेंड करना, ताकि भारत चीन की तरह धनी अर्थव्यवस्था बन सके, ये मॉडल, ये रास्ता हमारे लिए खुला नहीं है। और वो लंबा चौड़ा डिबेट है, लेकिन हम इसको उल्लेख कर, आप इसको दिमाग में रखे रहिए। तो ये हमारी विश लिस्ट है। और हमारी विश लिस्ट, हमारी इच्छा ये इसलिए है क्योंकि हम ये चाहते हैं कि इससे एनलाइटेंड और वेलफेयरिस्ट इंडस्ट्रियल कैपिटलिज्म का रास्ता पकड़ करके, जो रास्ता नहीं पकड़ा गया है हिंदुस्तान के जरिए, ये एनलाइटेंड वेलफेयरिस्ट इंडस्ट्रियल कैपिटलिज्म relatively speaking जनता के फेवर में होगा, कंपेयर टू क्रोनी कैपिटलिज्म, कंपेयर टू नेकेड प्राइवेट मोनोपोली काइंड ऑफ कैपिटलिज्म। सो ये कैपिटलिज्म के फेज में ही ये जनता के रिलेटिवली फेवर में होगा, और ये पॉसिबली मॉडल खड़ा करेगा कि फ्यूचर की सोशलिस्ट इकोनॉमी कैसे ऑर्गेनाइज की जाएगी। So I will quickly read the slide because I'm taking too much time. I wanted more discussion, more time for discussion. So अभी तक सिस्टम की बात हो रही थी. So far we were talking about the system. Now let us quickly come to rest of society. Rest of society is characterized by project modernity. For the rest of society we propose project modernity, and rest of society is defined by social features like religion, caste, gender, and so on. And this rest of society has two dimensions. One dimension is social relation. For example, caste relation. Caste is a relation, is a social relation, because it is hierarchical. It depends on both sides. No caste exists in itself. Every caste exists in relation to other castes. So, and this structure is a repressive, is a structure of oppression, exploitation, and exclusion. This is the social relation dimension is there in the rest of society, and also social identity is there, which overlaps with social relation, depends on social relation, but it has its own, its independent existence too. By social identity mean that I belong to this group, this caste or that religion, or that, yeah.
ये रिलीजन, कास्ट, जेंडर, ईटीसी में क्या क्या चीजें आएंगी?
इसीलिए तो हमने ईटीसी डाला ताकि गिनना ना पड़े, और आप गिनवा रहे हैं। उसमें एथनिसिटी आएगा, तरह तरह के छोटे छोटे ग्रुप्स आएंगे जो जिसमें उनकी ट्राइबल ग्रुप्स आएंगे, डिफरेंट ट्राइबल ग्रुप्स आएंगे, तरह तरह की एथनिसिटीज आएंगी, फाइनर डिविजन्स, सोशल डायमेंशंस के आएंगे। सो रिलीजन, कास्ट, जेंडर के अलावा कुछ नहीं बचता रेस्ट ऑफ सोसाइटी में। ये इंप्रेशन हम नहीं देना चाहते थे, इसीलिए हमने ईटीसी डाल दिया। सोशल आइडेंटिटी जो है वो रेस जैसे विजिबल आइडेंटिटी है, जेंडर जैसे विजिबल आइडेंटिटी है। आप देख के ही पहचान सकते हैं कि ये गोरा आदमी है कि ये काला आदमी है। देख के ही बाय एंड लार्ज पहचान सकते हैं कि ये मर्द है कि औरत है। तो ये विजिबल आइडेंटिटीज हैं, लेकिन इनविजिबल आइडेंटिटीज भी हैं। आप किसी को देख करके इमीडिएटली नहीं पहचान सकते कि ये ब्राह्मण है कि राजपूत है, वगैरह वगैरह, दोज एग्जाम्पल्स। एंड दीज टू थिंग्स, the social relation and social identity aspect of rest of society I am counting because, in the domain of social relation, which is where you have to fight injustices, you resist, the injustice. And often identity is used to establish solidarity to resist that injustice. अगर आप दलित के रूप में आपके ऊपर उत्पीड़न होता है, आपके ऊपर जाति होती है, तो आप इस बात से इनकार नहीं कर सकते कि आप दलित के रूप में अपने आपस में सॉलिडारिटी कायम करेंगे। और दलित के आइडेंटिटी के बेस पर जो सॉलिडारिटी कायम होगी उसका इस्तेमाल रेसिस्ट करने के लिए किया जाएगा। ये इसलिए पॉइंट आउट करना जरूरी है बिकॉज यू नीड टू you cannot have a very mechanical universalist elimination of all identities. Identities are, first of all, it is not in your hand to eliminate it. Secondly, it can play a positive role too. And yet when they play a positive role, when you establish solidarity on the basis of identity in order to resist unjust structures, social structures, then you should also keep in mind that the solidarity that arises out of identity, finally, our aim is to eliminate those identities which on the basis of which injustices happen. So finally, we would like to, in the long run, we would like to eliminate the identity of Dalit, but right now we may start by establishing solidarity on the basis of being Dalit. Those complex things, I just want to roughly flag it, so that the complexity that resides in the rest of society. And that is why, there are in rest of societies these two, for the movements, there are open questions, identity-based solidarity for resistance, I already talked about, to identity-based solidarity for resistance to identity-based oppression and exclusion, and dilution and dissolution of hierarchical identities in the long run. I already talked about it. And these are the challenges for social movement, because social movement, how do you run social movement? How do you organize social movement so that right now they intensify the identity for solidarity purposes, for fighting, but in the long run, that identity is dissolved. That is a challenge, and that is a very difficult challenge in front of social movements. We want caste system to end, and yet we cannot fight oppression of one caste done by another caste when from day one we raise the slogan that we are eliminating caste. Our declaration that we eliminate caste identities is not going to carry much weight. It is not going to work. So the complexity of reality, what we are trying to put our finger on. And for this, modernity is to be discussed by the social movement. The approach to modernity has to be discussed by the social movement. Even though modernity was of European origins, we define it by its universal core. So modernity is, for us, the universal core of modernity for us is not European, it is universal, because it treats every individual as equal. And because this universal core is planted in different cultures and societies, multiple forms of modernity arise, so that is where people have talked about the concept of multiple modernities. And that also leads to civilizational dimension, that, as we talked in the beginning, if beyond system and beyond rest of society, we also have to have this historical imaginary called a civilization on the subcontinent. Roughly, in our case, we call Indian civilization. Then how does Indian civilization, our definition and our preparation of Indian civilization, so that Indian cultural civilizational soil is prepared for adopting modernity, that civilizational dimension of modernity also comes into play. So let me quickly read it. If project modernity, our view, if socialism is left's project in the system arena, then modernity ought to be projects in the arena of the rest of society. Modernity, however, is a very controversial subject. It is often conceptualized as a component if not an instrument or a weapon of the Western civilization in modern times. Such a view is more likely to find it complicit in historical crimes of capitalism and colonialism. We at NSI take a very different view of modernity and define it in a different way. Our view of modernity is based on distilling its universal features from embodied modernities actually existing in West and elsewhere. We consider these essential and universal features to be desirable for all societies, but especially for a society like ours. Such an approach to modernity is of enormous practical importance too. It is especially so for social movements that fight against various forms of social oppressions and exclusion in a deeply hierarchical society like ours. In some ways, modernity is akin to religion. Although in most ways they are antithetical to each other, religion has existed, although they are in most ways they are antithetical to each other. Religion has existed in all societies and across varieties of polities, systems, and civilizations. It has always played an important role in the dynamics and flow of history. And yet, most of the time, this role, the role of religion, cannot be identified as clearly and as definitely as those of economy, nation, a state, or a king. Modernity, by comparison, is very young. It was born out of religion, and yet it has grown to challenge it at philosophical, ideological, and political levels. But despite the antinomies, it also resembles religion. It too has claims to universality, although of a different kind, and it too promises to live like a soul in many different bodies. It too carries potentials for spreading into diverse cultures and societies across the globe. Although the same seeds of modernity may yield very different harvests in different cultural and historical soil. Variations on this theme appear in many scholars who talk about what they call multiple modernities. It has been rather difficult to find what is the essence or seed of religion. The task may be easier in the case of modernity, but only relatively. A more tractable path may come into view by looking into the role religion has played in major civilizational transformations and how modernity is trying to accomplish something similar in the contemporary world. One can make use of one such window, which has been called the axial age. Civilizational transformation of that age have been often dubbed as axial transformation. This takes us to the project of India. This axial transformation, I don't have time. If you are interested, we can discuss in the discussion period. But most of you are familiar with the term axial civilization and axial transformation because we have, in NSI, we have often talked about it, And, we are considering transition to modernity as something like axial transformation. I will detail it out if you need it in the discussion section. So the civilizational dimension, this is towards the last part I have to talk. In addition, we have found compelling reasons for a third component that strives to grapple with the idea of India. This can also be visualized as the civilizational dimension, although we use the word civilization in a very special way. We consider it primarily as a historical imaginary that is deployed into the political project. A malignant but successful example will be Hindutva's idea, Hindutva's India, that feeds into the project of Hindu Rashtra. The example, kharab example hai historical imaginary ka Hindu Rashtra. लेकिन वो example है historical imaginary का. Hindu Rashtra is not historical; it is a historical imaginary. And we will have to have our own idea of India, which will be another historical imaginary. This view can easily be debunked for its historical distortions and fabrications of history, but that hardly suffices or confront it in the political arena. I mean, historians prove कर देंगे कि अयोध्या में राम पैदा हुए थे, इसका कोई प्रमाण नहीं है, लेकिन historians के प्रूव करने के बावजूद जो पॉलिटिकल पावर है हिंदू राष्ट्र का या अयोध्या के तीर्थस्थल होने का, राम के पैदा होने का, इंक्लूडिंग एक बिल्डिंग के नीचे पैदा होने का, वो उसका पॉलिटिकल पावर आप खत्म नहीं कर सकते. तो हिस्टोरियन से लड़ाई नहीं जीत सकते, ये पॉलिटिकल लड़ाई है. और इस पॉलिटिकल लड़ाई को जीतने के लिए जो हिंदुत्व का विरोधी पक्ष है उसको भी अपना आइडिया ऑफ इंडिया कंस्ट्रक्ट करना पड़ेगा. In fact, the competing ideas of India, whether of syncretic bhakti kind or of liberal constitutional kind, have been found too weak against the pull of idea of Hindu of India in the mass political arena of competitive electoral democracy. Left, on the other hand, has never seriously attempted to discover or invent its own idea of India. Depending on the context, it has oscillated between the anti-colonial nationalism and internationalism. Neither of these standpoints can be entirely rejected, but they do not suffice either, nor do proclamations about unity in diversity measure up to the task. An idea of India that is based on the civilizational accomplishment of the people of the subcontinent and feeds into pan-Indian civilizational identity must be put together in such a way that it stands over and transcends the religious sectarian identities and histories. This, in the long run, is indispensable for mobilizing the actually existing. Okay, so time scale of Project India is very different from the other two projects. By other two project, I mean Project Socialism and Project Modernity. Project India cannot be a mass political project from the start. You know, if you make it mass political project, it will become something like Hindu Rashtra. That is what right now masses will absorb as the idea of India. So it has to be done differently. It has to be first adopted by the left and the enlightened elite. Then ways can be found to take it to the mass political arena. State power will play the most effective role in taking Project India forward. And this will eliminate the threat of the malignant project of Hindu Rashtra. Okay, so I will leave India in the world part because I don't have time. And this left. So let me stop here and we can come back to things later. Yeah. I'm sorry about the time business. So I'm sorry about the interruptions. I'm sorry about taking time, but I mean, this is I wanted to just give you a quick run of how NSI thinks about everything, about world, about India, about society, about modernity, about civilization, and everything else. And this, we have struggled with this framework for last 15, 20 years. Now it is coming into place gradually, and it is very different from how a standard left thinks about. So this is, it already. For most of you, today's presentation is a repetition, but it was purposefully done in this way so that you are reminded of the whole thing in one way, and then we will further elaborate it in future meetings. But right now, still, I think, you will not mind staying back for an hour or more, and we can thrash it out, at least the framework part today. So over to you, Bhargav and Subhash.
ना बड़ा फ्रेमवर्क है और उसमें टाइम लगना तो प्रेजेंटेशन का टाइम लगना तो स्वाभाविक है और टेक्निकल दिक्कतें जो भी आई